Greetings, friends, and welcome to this Sabbath day. Services via the internet for the second day of August 2014. It's the 6th day of the 5th month on God's holy sacred calendar. Do you see, I didn't hesitate on that one. I know the holy days. I pay attention to those very carefully, friends. I've started operating myself because from the holy day calendar, God's sacred calendar, the Hebrew calendar, because after Jesus Christ returns, that will be the only calendar that the whole world is operating by. No more Roman calendar from the Roman Empire and from the Roman Catholic Church, which has made some changes to it and would change it further if they could in certain ways. But welcome to services today, friends. I hope you've had a good week. I sure did look forward today to a day of rest. And last night, God gave me some, even though I got up in the middle of the night a couple times and prayed, looked at some sermons, found this one in the middle of the night as I was asking God, hey, what to show today? Found one with Mr. Armstrong having visited Jerusalem, Israel, and had a talk with the Speaker of the Knesset there. We're going to show that meeting during today's services. And I've got several other videos related to news. In fact, I'm going to start with one that relates to something this year is significantly tied to in a way. This is 2014, exactly 1 century ago. In 1914, World War I, round one of World War began 100 years ago. And there are several things in news that are relating to that century ago in a significant way. But first I want to mention a couple of things, and then I'm going to play one video that relates back to World War I before we go to Mr. Armstrong, and then I have several other videos for you. So I'll be coming back after Mr. Armstrong speaks in his meeting from Jerusalem with the Speaker of the Knesset there in 1983. Very interesting things. Both Mr. Armstrong and Menachem, the Speaker of the Knesset, said. I'll introduce him to you in a moment. But friends, for one thing that relates back 100 years ago to right now, to 1914, at that time, the Arab world had an Islamic caliphate. The Ottoman Empire was in place. And with what's happening in the Middle East, in Syria, and in Iraq with ISIS, ISIS, what will that mean for the United States, friends, if, as is being talked about in the news, and news is such right now that even on the Sabbath, we shouldn't take a break from watching news, and I have several of today's news stories for you to cover after Mr. Armstrong speaks. But this first story will be related to the century ago when round one of World War started. And I was asking the question to you, for the United States, what would an Islamic caliphate mean? And that subject is in the current news. Well, for the United States, an Islamic caliphate is a severe threat to the Yankee dollar and to national security, as ISIS, ISIS, or ISIL could abolish the petrodollar agreement America has with OPEC and the Saudi government, and in addition, could potentially cause a new oil crisis. Now, also in the current news is something we'll discuss more fully later, but I'm just going to mention a couple of highlight things before Mr. Armstrong speaks. Germany made a decision already to leave the EU, leave the Euro, and leave NATO. Now, I know the last one may not be too much of a shock, that it will want to leave NATO. In fact, Germany is working to essentially bash NATO. And even from the time Germany became involved with the coining of the euro, or the printing of the euro, that's been an effort to bash the Yankee dollar and get it out of Europe and to get it out of position as the world reserve currency and as the petro currency. But these other couple of things, I'll have full news story on it related to a decision Germany's already made to leave the EU. Now, some of you that know prophecy and understand things that are on this chart will be saying, let me bring this chart forward for a moment. The next major thing in prophecy is the fifth seal from Revelation, the Great Tribulation. That's the time when the united Europe, as we understand it from prophecy that God gave us through Mr. Herbert Armstrong, and that can be proved through the book of Revelation, Greek word apocalypse. When that fifth seal comes alive, several things will happen. It'll be a time of the martyrdom, a great martyrdom of God's saints. It'll be the time of Jacob's trouble. And it'll be the time of Jacob's trouble brought on by what the Bible calls a beast, which will be a new emperor of a revived Holy Roman Empire, but influenced or really ruled over by the influence of the false prophet. And so, friends, when to bring that about, that beast, that new leader of a revived Holy Roman Empire, we've seen, well, the coming together of united Europe. Here it comes and shaping. And even though there's 28 nations presently in it, 17 or 18 of them circulate the euro and are therefore called part of the Eurozone. But now, wait a minute, and we've understood Germany is most likely to be the head of the revived Holy Roman Empire. We've understood that Assyria from the past has been the country that's wanted to rule the world. It started round one of World War II. It started round two, or it was the main prolificator of round two of World War. And we're waiting for those 10 toes, 5 on the left leg and foot from the left leg and 5 from the right foot from the right leg, which we've understood to be the divisions east and west of the Roman Empire. And so there'd be 5, if not nations or countries, there'd be regions from the east and 5 from the west. So there may be, we've understood it to be that means there could be some remapping of Europe, and the combining of countries or areas. And you take a look at what's happening in the Middle East with ISIS and Iraq, and they're wanting to restructure what France and England structured toward the end of World War II, when they drew a straight line across and reboundarized and created Iraq the way it is today. But ISIS is trying to change that. Well, there may be some changes within the EU, but now wait a minute, Steve. If you say, and that's not me saying this, friends, this is a current news story that says Germany has made a decision already to leave the EU. Well, what would that do to prophecy if as we understand it, if Germany left the EU? Well, now look. Let me start out by saying this. This is just a news story, friends. It's really only someone's opinion. However, let's just take it on the other way. Let's say, suppose that did happen. When you hear this story, you'll understand how and why it could, in a way. Well, they might for a temporary time and then swing back around, or the unique position that Germany is in. I'm going to comment more fully on this later, but I'll just tell you briefly the unique position that Germany is in at one end, the east end of Europe, and then right next to Russia, that's still in that western tip of Russia is still in Europe, you know, and the dividing line for Europe and Asia has traditionally, the way the continents are traditionally set, the dividing line for Europe and Asia is toward the eastern part of Russia, but there's a good part of Russia that's in Europe. The eastern part of Russia is in Europe. So Russia's not totally Asia, you know, for its boundaries and location. And that's even with the current Russian boundaries, you know, where we haven't gone to the, you know, where the, not considering the disbanding of the USSR, which took a lot of space away from, land away from Russia, and Russia's been out there trying to nibble and grab some of it back. But let me just tell you the headline of the story. I'll go into the details later. Germany has already made a decision to leave the EU, to leave the Euro, and to leave NATO and join the BRICS, B-R-I-C-S nations. And then, well, I'll tell you about the currency they're talking about later when I go to the full story. Brother Reuben has announced he plans to follow. France is also hedging strongly towards abandoning the United States and the European Union. And, you know, we've anticipated France might leave the European Union. But this in the current news because of recent events involving the U.S. and the U.S. indictment and fining of the French bank BNP Paribas for actions they did more than 5 years ago. The United States, Brother Manasseh's real reason for the indictment against the French bank was that BNP Paribas was actually facilitating the dumping of the U.S. treasuries by Russia and other BRICS nations, and was causing severe trouble for the Yankee dollar and global reserve currency. Now, I'm going to put some slides up before Mr. Armstrong. I hope you won't mind. I'm going to put some slides up maybe before Mr. Armstrong speaks and show you the BRICS nations, or maybe might be better let Mr. Armstrong speak to you, and then I'll show you those. I've got a world map, and I got the sections colored for Brazil and Russia and India and China, that you can get a good visualization of the BRICS economies and nations that Germany is talking about dealing with and bailing out of the EU and bailing out of the Euro and bailing out of NATO. But let me just mention this. News from Uganda yesterday is rather appalling. Uganda, which had passed an anti-gay law after pressure from the United States President Barack Obama and so-called gay rights organizations, annulled their anti-gay law, and with it, having joined in this rebellion against God, we will sure see some fallout from that, because of how God says a nation and its individuals are blessed if they obey God, but cursed if they do not obey God, if they reject God's law. It's good to review Leviticus 26 or Deuteronomy 28, the blessings and cursings chapters, as we've called them for a long time at Ambassador College. And I'll have video on the news from Uganda, from today's news, after we see and hear Mr. Armstrong speak a little bit here today. One more story I want to mention first relates to the UN and the UN human rights boss. I have a video showing her from the news about a week ago, Wednesday or Thursday of the preceding week, and that you may remember seeing that. We showed that on Nightcast. It showed her saying that Israelis' actions could be war crimes, and she as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, her name Navi Pillay, speaking at the organization's emergency session a week and a half ago, she said there seems to be a strong possibility that international law has been violated, at least, and so what she did was she called for investigations of every alleged act on the part of Israel to be investigated as to whether it was a war crime or not. And even worse now, in the current news, here she is again from yesterday, actually from Friday. Yeah, just yesterday. She says it seems like people finding ways they can. It seems to me she's trying to grab the spotlight after having seen that she could get it with saying, hey, we got to investigate Israel for war crimes. And this time it's gone a little bit on the side. I'm going to come right out and call a spade a spade. It's gone to from bad to worse to loony. And I'll cover that story during today's Sabbath service about how Navi Pillay, the UN human rights boss that I'm telling you about, in the news story from yesterday, from Friday, she's gone from wanting to condemn Israel through investigations of every possible incident of their actions being a war crime, to now just this past Friday, just yesterday, now condemning Israel. Friends, this is so loony, I almost don't even want to speak it. But she wants to condemn Israel. She is condemning Israel for, can you believe this, for not sharing the Iron Dome with Hamas. You think I'm joking? I'll play the video for you during today's service. You'll be able to hear the crazy woman in a unique position of power in the UN. You'll be able to hear her with your own ears, and she's in a position it seems may have been designed especially by the God of this world so that one person, a woman, can give the entire nation of Israel one whale of a bad time. You know, you don't give weapons to a people who have as their goal the total destruction of your country as a nation and your people as a tribe of Israel from Isaac. Annihilation. The half-brother of Isaac wants to kill his half-nephew Jacob and all of Jacob's descendants. You know, Uncle Jacob's name was changed by God. I'm calling him Uncle Jacob in reference to Ishmael. Jacob's name was changed by God to Israel, and then Israel had 12 sons, and nephew Ishmael wants to kill all of the descendants of Israel. You don't allow a person with a goal like that to have weapons to play with, and you don't share your defense secrets with him. Mama Pillay, Navi Pillay, talks like this is just a little kid squabble, you know, where the kids should learn to share their toys. But this is not a kid's game, and that Iron Dome is not a kid's toy. The influence behind the scenes is the archenemy of the great God, and God's enemy is a very powerful, world-ruling being with millions of angels turned demon under him. All right, friends, now we're going to go to Mr. Armstrong, and after this first video, after Mr. Armstrong, I'm going to play a video that sets the significance of the time we're in against some current news that relates to 100 years ago when round one of World War began, 1914 to 1918, treaty signed in 1919. But friends, in this talk, Mr. Armstrong is in Jerusalem in a meeting with the Speaker of the Knesset there. And at the point where we're going into this video, Mr. Armstrong had just been asked a question by a viewer who asked him, when you go over there and speak to these leaders of these nations, do you preach Jesus Christ to them? Do you know, this or that? And let's pick up there with Mr. Armstrong's answer as to what he talks about when he talks to world leaders. Does he preach Jesus Christ? Do you, Mr. Armstrong, preach Jesus Christ? Does that person ask you when you go over there and speak to these? We're going to repeat that. Mr. Armstrong, when you go over to speak to these world leaders, sir, do you preach Jesus Christ to them, as that person wrote in and asked you?
Christ? No, and even Jesus himself, when he was on earth, didn't ask people to receive him, and wouldn't they give their hearts to him? He talked to them about the things they were interested in, and I talked to heads of government about world conditions, about their concerns and worries, and about world peace and how it's going to come. I talk to them about the way to world peace. I tell them we're not going to have world peace of our own efforts. It's not going to come that way. But I do tell them about the second coming of Christ, and that God is going to send Jesus Christ to this earth to set up the kingdom of God. One nation ruling the entire world, all nations, and to bring us peace. We won't do it ourselves. God is going to have to do it to us. Now, in my most recent trip, I was visiting both Jordan and Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, I had a private conversation with Menachem Salvador, the Speaker of the Knesset. Now, the Knesset, as I think most of you know, is their Congress or their parliament, their lawmaking body. For the first time, so far as I know, they allowed a private television crew to take for television this conference between me and the Speaker of the Knesset. I was accompanied in this interview by my own personal aide, Aaron Dean, by our world news editor for the Plain Truth, Mr. Gene Hogberg, and by the recent Consul General of Israel to Los Angeles, Michael Ravid. So now I want to show you that conversation just as it was televised by our own television crew.
You know that we have some basic problems in the Israel economy, and then there are the conjunctural ones. Mm-hmm. The basic problems are that a country is spending 1/3 of its gross national product on defense, 1/3 to pay off debts. Now we are a coalition government, and the tail is wagging the dog.
Yes.
In other words, every small splinter group is stretching out the arm. They are not Armstrong, they are arm weak.
Yes.
And they ask for money to run their ministries and to prove that they are successful. And since 1/3 of our gross national product is inadequate to provide all this welfare and education and development, they address themselves to a printing press. I'm simplifying a complicated subject, Mr. Armstrong.
Well, do you know, I see now, as I didn't when I was younger, the trouble in the whole world. And it's the trouble here, it's the trouble in other places, and it's the world trouble. It's every man for himself. People will join together and ally in groups, provided that group can be against some other group. It's person against person, group against group. Two cannot walk together in peace except they be agreed. If there's contention, and if they're in a bad attitude and one is trying to get the best of the other or take from the other, you have no basis for peace. Now that's the trouble in the whole world.
Mr. Salvador, knowing that Mr. Armstrong has been a frequent visitor to Jordan and had just completed a 5-day visit to Amman, asked his impression of the mood there today.
How did you find any esprit ouvert, what we say in French, any open-heartedness and a new spirit that we could engage in a dialogue and hammer out a settlement between us and our cousins?
Last time I talked with King Hussein was last March, and I told him that one thing that I would like to do would be to get him and Mr. Begin together on my jet aircraft. And I said, I know Mr. Begin would like to do it, and I know you would, if. And he began to laugh, and he said, yes, I would, if. The if is the other Arab nations and what they would say about it. I find that the Jordanians do not feel as hostile toward Israel now as I think other Arab nations do.
Well,
I think they really would like to be friends.
There is a variety, but
they still have different ideas about, especially the West Bank and things like that, you know.
Well, I would like to tell you, Mr. Armstrong, and this is a fact. About the 18th or 17th day after the war broke out
in Lebanon,
and Syria was beaten, and Soviet prestige was at the lowest ebb, and the source of intimidation was not there. But then they started with new plans. Instead of giving it a push and a momentum, sit down and discuss peace, you wanted, I say you, the American government wanted to enlist at the same time the full friendship of Syria and the PLO. And, you know, there were all sorts of negotiations behind our back, and they allowed the Soviets to rearm and to reintroduce themselves with 5,000 more experts and new, more sophisticated, dangerous weaponry, and that's where we failed.
Okay, friends, we're going to come out of that interview at that point right there, where Mr. Salvador makes an outstanding point as he spoke with Mr. Armstrong about allowing the Soviets to be rearmed. The United States made a mistake where it could have jumped in and done something to help hold that back, prevent that. And that relates to the news stories we were talking about today with that UN human rights boss trying to say, one, all of Israel's actions needs to be investigated as against war crimes, being war crimes, and now Friday in Friday's news, we'll get to that story in a moment, saying that Israel should share the Iron Dome with Hamas. Friends, this is 2014. 100 years since the start of World War I in 1914, 100 years ago, 100 years since the start of that war, World War, round one, continues around the world. Our countries around the world are remembering events. I'm reading you the lead-in to a video clip I'm going to show you from today's news. Germany, that relates back to 1914. Germany's commemorations have been low-key compared to most other nations that fought. The Berlin Historical Museum is holding the only exhibition in Germany to look at the war and its European and global implications. The BBC went to see some of the key exhibits, which you'll see featured in this video by video journalist Dan Damon.
Sounds. The soldiers had to put on the gas masks. The gas mask is an icon of the First World War. My name is Andreas Mix. I'm one of the curators of the exhibition 1914-1918, the First World War, here in Berlin in the German Historical Museum. Our exhibition will give an overview on the First World War with 14 places, concrete places and battlefields like Verdun, Somme or Isonzo, but also big cities like Berlin and Petrograd. The Prussian militarism was a strong fact. Yeah, troops are marching through the streets in European capitals like London, Paris, Berlin, Petrograd. Yeah, it was a popular phenomenon all over Europe. You can see the dress code of the British Field Marshal, the uniform of Kaiser William II. The uniform was a gift by his cousin, King Edward, and that's a revolver from Queen Victoria for William II. These objects demonstrate, the strong relationship between the German Empire and Great Britain. The Kaiser promised you will celebrate Christmas at home, but it was unfulfilled hope. That's a steel helmet of Ernst Jünger. He was wounded, several times wounded, during the fightings near to the Somme. He was a very famous German author. He wrote a book about the First World War called Storm of Steel, in German, in Stahlgewittern. And that's a British steel helmet. It was a British officer, his helmet, and Jünger captured this. And here on the photo he stood next to the dead man. It's a horrible picture.
Friends, now if you missed the report that we had a couple of weeks ago where the High UN Commissioner for Human Rights said that a lot of Israel's actions could amount to war crimes, as she put it. I want to show you that video. If you missed it from a couple of weeks ago, I have that here for us, and I'm going to play that. Now, speaking to, and by the way, after we show some news, we are going to go back to Mr. Armstrong with more from his meeting. And I think after I show you some news, you'll see just how much what is said in that meeting and in that particular broadcast, how much that relates to what's happening today, because the news stories I'm showing you right now are stories from today's news. Now, this one is going to go back, today's news, and by that I mean, since we were on last Thursday night, that includes some news from Friday, and this particular story that I'm going back to the archives for goes back to last Wednesday or Thursday, not last week, but the week before, when that UN commissioner said, we got to investigate all of Israel's actions to see if they're war crimes. But then yesterday now, okay, and this is, and then after this, I'll play you video from yesterday's news where the UN Human Rights Chief Navy Pillay is speaking again in a very crazy way. But I want you to see what leads up to this. From a week and a half ago, speaking at the organization's emergency session. Now, this is the organization being the UN Human Rights Organization. Speaking at an emergency session on the situation there a week and a half ago, she said there seems to be a strong possibility that international law has been violated. And she goes on and describes how many people were killed up to that point in time in Gaza, and says Israel, some things against Israel. I'm not going to go into all those, but then she condemns Israel in this video report. Again, this is from a week ago, last Thursday's news.
This is SP59.
Oops. Okay, friends, I'm sorry. Let's see, I got my videos. I bumped Mr. Armstrong up early. So now let's go to that news report from a week and a half ago.
The indiscriminate firing by Hamas and other armed groups of more than 2,900 rockets as well as mortars from Gaza continues to endanger the lives of civilians in Israel. I have repeatedly condemned such indiscriminate attacks in the past.
Friends, she started out good, and if she just stopped there, maybe another comment or two against Hamas, I might have had a lot of praise for Ms. Pillay. But unfortunately, she goes on.
I do so again today. I further emphasize that it is unacceptable to locate military assets in densely populated areas or to launch attacks from such areas. However, international law is clear. The actions of one party do not absolve the other party of the need to respect its obligations under international law.
Friends, all right, I paused our video player and it went white on us. I hope it's going to unfreeze here in a moment. But I stopped her just to make this comment, as I did during the Nightcast news program when I played this week ago, Thursday. And her statement is actually not correct. I worked for lawyers and for a judge for some time in Los Angeles, and there's a doctrine of law called the doctrine of unclean hands. And that's a long-established doctrine in law. And it says, excuse me, Ms. Pillay, it says that if your hands are unclean in a certain thing, you can't bring an action for that same thing against another person. Jesus Christ upheld that doctrine of unclean hands when a woman caught in adultery was brought before him, and they wanted Christ to judge that according to the old law that required stoning of someone caught in adultery. Well, the Levitical priesthood was not in place effectually at the time. The Roman, as for their civil government, the Roman government had the authority of the area where the Jews and Christ were living in Palestine then. And so Christ, first of all, he deferred to them. He hadn't seen her himself. They would need some witnesses, but he said, well, okay, the one of you who's without sin, let him throw the first stone. And with those words, Jesus Christ upheld that long-established doctrine in law, the doctrine of unclean hands. If your hands are unclean, you can't, convict somebody else. Hamas's hands are, and she said, she tried to undo the doctrine of unclean hands by her statement and claiming that it, is a violation of international law. Well, international law has a problem if it's got that in there that says if, you can't defend Anyway, that's the news story from a week and a half ago. Now, I'm not going to play the rest of that because, for one thing, I think the video player's hung up. I may have to recycle everything. But I want to take us on, friends, and get back to a little more from Mr. Armstrong. And I do have quite a few news stories that I want to play for you. Now, in this next one, the UN condemns Israel for not sharing Iron Dome with Hamas. This is from yesterday's news. Now this is from, not a video, this is a news story I got from the Houston Politics Examiner, an article written by Mark Whittington, who says, among a bill of particulars of alleged violations of human rights by Israel against the people of Gaza, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, who you see on your screen now, behind me, she listed the fact that Israel has not shared the Iron Dome anti-missile technology with Hamas. Now, that was according to a Thursday story in the Breitbart National Security. Now, which says the Iron Dome, it reminds us the Iron Dome is partly financed by the United States. And that Iron Dome, it says in this article, has been instrumental in blunting the Hamas terror missile bombardment on Israeli civilians. Navi Pillay, U.S. Commissioner for the Human Rights Organization, complained that no such protection has been provided for Hamas in Gaza. Excuse me. Israel is trying to take the weapons and tunnel building from an organization that has in its charter the goal of the destruction of Israel. You don't give them your technology that would defeat you from airstriking them. Excuse me? Duh. This is not a kid's game. This is not, oh, you kids need to share your toys time. Anyway, this article goes on to say Israel is currently conducting a campaign in Gaza to eliminate Hamas rocket batteries, as well as elaborate and extensive tunnels used to infiltrate terrorists into Israel to commit murder and mayhem. Because of Hamas' tactic of using civilians as human shields and civilian structures such as schools and hospitals as military sites, this has resulted in numerous civilian casualties in Gaza. Israel maintains that it has no choice but to continue to campaign lest they be forced to endure continued terror attacks from Gaza. Pillay and other critics of Israel have pronounced themselves unimpressed with this argument. Pillay, her implicit demand that Israel share a piece of crucial defense technology with an enemy that is, again, dedicated to utter annihilation. It's as if the United States were required to share the let's see, must have a mistype here in my notes, friends. It's as if the United States were required to share the certain bomb site with Nazi Germany or the secret of the atomic bomb with Japan. But it seems to bespeak an attitude that holds that it's unfair that Israel is better at the art of war, including defending its people against terror rocket bombardment, than her enemies. The United Nations has had a record of bias against Israel ever since the infamous resolution that equated Zionism with racism that as passed in the 1970s. The UN Human Rights Council has been especially egregious in this regard. Its membership, which includes some of the worst human rights abuses on the planet, including China, Russia, Cuba, and Saudi Arabia, as well as past members North Korea and Iran, might have something to do with that, the article concludes. Okay, friends, and I have, brethren, I have another, during Nightcast during the week, we do have viewers who are other than brethren. Today, on the Sabbath Service channel, I take the presumption that most who tune in here are brethren. That's what we kind of designated the live stream for this day, is to be for brethren who want to keep the Sabbath. But I've got a video for you next from news. This one goes back to our archive. Let's see, are we repeating this? Let me see what I've got in my notes here. 100 years after the start of World War I, the Ottoman Empire returns. Let's see, friends, did we play this? No, we haven't played this yet, have we? On June 29, just one day after the 100th anniversary of the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the extremist group known as the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIS, declared the establishment of a new caliph, or fully Islamic state, in the terrorist territories of Syria and Iraq that they control. The significance of the date this was declared upon, as well as the intended purpose, ties it intrinsically to 100 years ago, when the last true Islamic empire and caliph ruled the Middle East under the Ottoman Turks. When the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by Serbian terrorists, it activated a series of alliances and treaties that pitted one side of Europe and the Middle East against another. And from what would become the Axis powers during the war, Germany called upon the aid of the Ottoman Empire, or Ottoman Caliphate, to fight against Britain and their empire, which stretched across the world from Egypt to India and even to Hong Kong. The Al-Qaeda breakaway group that has seized much of northern Syria and huge tracts of neighboring Iraq formally declared the creation of an Islamic State on Sunday in the territory under its control. The spokesman for the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, Abu Muhammad al-Adnani, made the announcement in an audio statement posted online. Islamic extremists have long dreamed of recreating the Islamic State, or Caliphate, that ruled over the Middle East for hundreds of years. The significance of this declaration means that nations which were born out of the Versailles Treaty in 1919 and ripped away from the defeated Ottoman Empire after the war could hear the clarion call from the new caliph and call upon Muslims everywhere, including those residing currently in sovereign nations, to give their allegiance to ISIS and join the battle against Western and secular rule in the Middle East. For the United States, an Islamic Caliphate, as I mentioned at the opening of this live stream, friends, for the United States, an Islamic Caliphate is a severe threat to the dollar, to the Yankee dollar, and to national security, as ISIS could abolish the petrodollar agreement America has with OPEC and the Saudi government, and in addition could potentially cause a new oil crisis, as ISIS already controls several oil fields within the state of Iraq. While it only took Germany 25 to 30 years to begin seizing territory it lost to the Allied countries after World War I, for the survivors and descendants of the Ottoman Empire, declaring a return of the ancient caliphate on the 100th anniversary of its own demise and breakup will create significant and meaningful repercussions to the entire world, especially now that the global financial system is so interlocked and reliant on the free flow of oil trade. Jim Wiley confirms that Germany is ready to leave the EU, to leave the Euro, and to leave NATO. In this July 24, 2014 article in the Finance Examiner by Kenneth Shortgen Jr., we find the following. I'm going to read this to you, friends. On July 23rd, Dr. Jim Wiley, a well-respected statistician, provided an announcement from a high-level source within the London banking system that Germany was on the cusp of severing its long-standing obligations to the U.S. and was ready to leave not only the European Union but also the euro currency and NATO, to then join up with Russia, China, and the BRICS, B-R-I-C-S coalition, to strengthen the financial and economic power of the emerging global system coming out of Eurasia and the East. Now, friends, I want to show you, before I go on with this article, I want to show you some slides. All right, now here's a wall map of the entire globe. In the center where you see the red is the Eurozone. And then, now going from there, I have colored up the four areas that make up the BRICS coalition, the BRIC part. And that's the main thing for the moment. We'll mention the BRICS that includes South Africa a little later, maybe. But the BRIC, the BRIC nations, the BRICS nations, or the BRICS economies, they refer to it in several different ways, the BRICS coalition. The BRIC, each one of those letters stand for a country. The B stands for Brazil. As you can see here on the map, I've got Brazil in green. That's the first letter for the BRIC part. The R stands for Russia. The I stands for India. You see in the green here at the bottom of Asia. And the BRIC, the C stands for China, which you see in the green here, this part. And then we'll put all those together, and you've got Brazil, Russia, BR, BRI, so you got Brazil, Russia, and India, and Brazil, Russia, India, and China, the green area that you see in this map. Those are your BRICS coalition countries. Sometimes an S is added to the end of BRICS in a capital letter, and then that will include South Africa, which I don't have a green area for that, but sometimes that's included. And I'll explain that. The rest of this article explains the significance of the BRIC situation. Germany is already disgruntled with the United States for the aggressive tactics the United States used in trying to usurp Ukraine from their age-old position in the Russian camp, and from day one has been opposing the Germany has been opposing the American superpowers' attempts to bring in Europe to solidify sanctions on Russia, which have been done outside the vote of the United Nations and solely for the benefit of U.S. national policy and protection of the Yankee dollar. Jim Wiley says he got word from a client, and he says, I call him London Paul. He's a former banker in London who does a lot of private consulting, investigation, and feasibility studies and other general work with a bunch of clients. Now, I'm quoting from this article, friends. He just came back from a client trip where some Russians told him that their information confirmed by Asian partners is that they have heard Germany made a decision already to leave the EU, leave the Euro, and leave NATO and join BRICS, B-R-I-C, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Those BRICS nations, and come about full force to back the new BRICS gold currency. Now that's according to USA Watchdog. Besides Germany in the Eurozone, France Brother Reuben is also hedging strongly towards abandoning the United States and the European Union because of recent events involving the U.S. and the U.S. indictment and fining of the French bank BNP Paribas for actions they did more than 5 years ago during a time of American sanctions in the Sudan. However, as Dr. Jim Wiley proposed in a second interview he did on July 23rd with Silver Doctors, the real reason behind this indictment from the United States against the Russian bank was that BNP Paribas was actually facilitating the dumping of the U.S. treasuries by Russia and other BRICS nations and was causing severe trouble for the dollar and global reserve currency. Germany has a vital interest in ensuring their relations with Russia and China and not hindering in any way, especially since they rely upon these BRICS member nations for 30% of their oil imports and 40% of their national gas needs. Additionally, over 3,000 German companies do a great deal of business with the BRICS coalition, and their economy is now more reliant upon the East than it is on the U.S. and Western countries. Thus, Germany has already seen the writing on the wall for a sea change in global economic and financial authority, and Germany is very likely that as the U.S. resorts to armed conflicts and espionage to protect their control over dollar hegemony, the linchpin to Europe and the entire European Union will assuredly look out for themselves and move forward in a partnership with the next power structure that will rule the global financial system. Okay, friends, that's the end of that article. Something very much to be aware of. And now another article. Russia has made a land for gas deal. Merkel and Putin discussed a secret deal that could end up, that they believe could end the Ukraine crisis. This comes from an article in Thursday's July 21. I think this is from the Independent, written by Margareta Pergano in the Independent. She says Merkel and Putin negotiate to trade Crimea's sovereignty for guarantees on energy security and trade. She says Germany and Russia have been working on a secret plan to broker a peaceful solution to end international tensions over Ukraine. The Independent can reveal that the peace plan being worked on by both Angela Merkel and Vladimir Putin hinges on two main ambitions: stabilizing the borders of Ukraine and providing the financially troubled country with a strong economic boost, particularly a new energy agreement ensuring security of gas supplies. More controversially, if Ms. Merkel's deal were to be acceptable to the Russians, the international community would need to recognize Crimea's independence and its annexation by Russia, a move that some members of the United Nations might find difficult to stomach. Sources close to the secret negotiations claim that the first part of the stabilization plan requires Russia to withdraw its financial and military support for the various pro-separatist groups operating in eastern Ukraine. As part of any such agreement, the region would be allowed some devolved powers. At the same time, the Ukrainian president would agree not to apply to join NATO in return. Or in return, President Putin would not seek to block or interfere with Ukraine's new trade relations with the European Union under a pact signed a few weeks ago. Second, Ukraine would be offered a new long-term agreement with Russia's Gazprom, the giant gas supplier, for future gas supplies and pricing. At present, there is no gas deal in place. Ukraine's gas supplies are running low and are likely to run out before this winter, which would spell economic and social ruin for the country. As part of the deal, Russia would compensate Ukraine with a $1 billion financial package for the loss of the rent it used to pay for stationing its fleets in Crimea and at the port of Sevastopol on the Black Sea until Crimea voted for independence in March. However, these attempts by Ms. Merkel to act as a broker between President Putin and Ukraine, Ukraine's President Petro Poroshenko, were put on the back burner following the shooting down of the MH17 plane in eastern Ukraine. But insiders who are party, now I'm still reading from this article, friends, insiders who are party to the discussion said yesterday that the German peace plan is still on the table and the only deal around. Negotiations have stalled because of the MH17 disaster, but they are expected to restart once the investigation has taken place. Now, this photograph, you see Vladimir Putin at a natural gas pipeline in Russia's Far East in 2011. As part of the deal, Russia would compensate Ukraine, we mentioned that, with $1 billion financial package for the loss of rent that Russia used to pay for stationing its fleets in Crimea at the port of Sevastopol on the Black Sea until Crimea voted for independence in March. Now, friends, let's see. I have in my notes on the teleprompter, I'm reading this article to you. I have repeated some of that. Let me run the teleprompter ahead. Picking up here with the article, it is in everyone's interest to do a deal. Hopefully, talks will be revived if a satisfactory outcome can be reached to investigations now taking place as to the cause of the MH17 catastrophe. Closer trading ties with the EU have been one of the big ambitions of Mr. Poroshenko's presidency. He has been a staunch supporter of the country's pro-European movement, even though he is unaffiliated to any political party. He was one of the backers of the 2004 Orange Revolution and served as foreign minister under Yulia Tymoshenko. A spokesman for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office said they had no knowledge of such negotiations taking place. However, the spokesman said he thought it highly unlikely that either the U.S. or U.K. would agree to recognizing Russian control over Crimea. There was no one available at the German embassy's press office yesterday. Reaching a solution to the ongoing dispute is pertinent for the Germans, as Russia is their single biggest trading partner. under Miss Merkel, the Russo-German axis has strengthened significantly, and until the plane shooting of the MH17, her government had been staunchly against punitive sanctions for commercial but also diplomatic reasons. Such strong trade ties between the two countries has also served to strengthen Miss Merkel's hand, and the Russian speaker has emerged as the leading advocate of closer relations between the EU and Russia. This is Merkel's deal. She's been dealing direct with President Putin on this side. She needs to solve the dispute because it is in no one's interest to have tension in Ukraine or to have Russia out in the cold. And the article ends by saying, no one wants another Cold War, according to one insider close to the negotiations. Some of Germany's biggest companies have big operations in Russia, which is now one of Europe's biggest car markets, while many of its small to medium companies are also expanding into the country. Although Russia now provides EU countries with a third of their gas supplies through pipelines crossing Ukraine, Germany has its own bilateral pipeline marketing. Let me see if I can get back to that slide. Germany has its own bilateral gas pipelines direct to Russia, making it less vulnerable than other European countries. Ukrainian troops take up a position near the eastern city of a region in the Donetsk, in this picture. However, Russia is still the EU's third biggest trading partner, with cross-border trade of $460 billion. That's the equivalent of 272 billion pounds. That was their trade for last year, and the latest sanctions being introduced by the EU towards Russia, Russian individuals and banks, will hurt European countries more than any other, particularly Germany, but also the City of London. Central to the negotiations over any new gas deal with Gazprom is understood to be one of Ukraine's wealthiest businessmen, the gas broker Dmitry Firtash. Mr. Firtash, who negotiated the first big deal between Ukraine and Russia between 2006 and 2009, is now living in Vienna, fighting extradition charges from the Americans. But he has close relations with the Russian and Ukrainian leaders. He supported Mr. Poroshenko and has been acting as a go-between behind the scenes at the highest levels. Friends, brethren, I have next for us something important. It relates to the fourth seal of Revelation, one of the main things of the fourth seal, as Jesus Christ described it in plain language. In the Greek, he used the term loimos, which means disease epidemics, pestilence, the plagues of Egypt. And in current news related to the Ebola virus outbreak, this doctor will explain how patients are refusing isolation. Now, the audio is very bad in this, such that the BBC put subtitles at the bottom of it. And friends, because you might have a hard time reading it, I'm going to see if I can read them for you as this video plays. Convincing patients to get treatments is the biggest task facing medical professionals trying to confirm the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, a doctor in Sierra Leone says. Dr. Oliver Johnson also said persuading staff members to work with. Oh, friends, you know what? This is the lead-in for that, and I tell you what, let's do. Let me back that up because I want to read what he says to you as he's saying it. Now, Dr. Johnson also said persuading staff to work with him in the Ebola isolation unit in the capital, Freetown, was a challenge. The virus, which has claimed over 700 lives in 4 West African countries, has done so since February. Now, here, let's start it, and I'll try to help make sure you can understand it by reading these subtitles as this plays. I'm Dr. Oliver Johnson, a British doctor from King's Health Partners in London, standing outside the isolation unit at Connaught Hospital in Freetown, which is at the center of an outbreak of Ebola in West Africa. We've had 6 confirmed positive Ebola patients here over the last couple of weeks, and what we've seen today, the 2nd of August 2014, is the declaration of a state of national emergency by the President and a real increase in the international and local response. But challenges remain. There's fear and concern among the patients who either don't believe the disease is real or don't trust the hospital to treat them. So they're staying away from the hospital, they're refusing to be isolated here, and there's fear amongst staff that they will become sick if they come to work. So they are refusing to come to work, or they're afraid to come into this unit. So this will be the challenge over the next week. Can we convince patients that their best option is to come to the hospital early for treatment? And can we convince staff that they're safe working here in this unit? If we can do that, the doctor says, then this outbreak can be turned around, and that's what I hope. Now, friends, there is a verse of Scripture. Now, you know, that thing went by fast, didn't it? My notes rolled across a little slower. But there's a verse of Scripture on isolation, or as the King James calls it in Numbers 5, verse 2, to be put out of an, it's a quarantine, really. Numbers 5, verse 2 from the Bible says, command the children of Israel that they put out of the camp every leper and every one that hath an issue, and whosoever is defiled by a dead body, by the dead. So there's a Bible support for quarantine. And unfortunately, a news item I haven't got my hands on yet, but I saw somebody put on social media, is that 300 volunteers who worked in that Ebola unit are returning to the United States, possibly infected. And Bible calls for keeping yourself quarantined so you don't spread these infectious diseases to others. And here's some video from today, friends. This video is from just a few hours ago today. That U.S. doctor who became infected with the deadly Ebola virus in Liberia has been flown back to the U.S. He arrived in the U.S. for treatment at a specialized unit in Atlanta, Georgia today. Aerial footage shows Dr. Kent Brantly arrived by ambulance at Emory University Hospital wearing protective clothing. While he's coming out, I'll just tell you, Ebola has claimed 728 lives in...
That this is the first patient with Ebola in the United States, but I think that's the key point. I can't think of a better place in the world other than Emory University Hospital to care for this patient. We are ready. We are looking forward to trying to help this patient. We can provide the supportive care to try and support this patient and allow his own immune system to develop antibodies to really fight the infection. That's our goal. That's our hope. The mortality rates that are being reported are just that. It's reported in Africa. Our hope is that in an area where we have the public health infrastructure to really support this patient, the mortality rate might be much lower.
Okay, certainly hope so, friends, because 90% of sufferers of this disease are killed from it. And here we've got it right next door to me over in Atlanta, Georgia. That's a state adjacent to Alabama. Friends, here's something from the news that you just might find interesting or might find an answer to why am I seeing this all over my social media and on people's hands and here and there. This is the Arabic letter for N. You may have seen several people and organizations change their profile pictures on social media to it, including the Church of England and the Archbishop of Canterbury. You might also have seen people drawing it on their hands and using the hashtag #WEARN. It's part of a campaign in solidarity with persecuted Christians in Iraq. Several have had the letter put on their doorways to show that those inside are Nazarene, which means Christians in Arabic. People professing the faith based on Christianity have lived in Mosul, Iraq's second city, for 2,000 years. But last month they were told to flee, pay a tax, or convert to Islam. And this requirement was made by fighters from the Islamic State, formerly known as ISIS, or ISIS, or ISIL, or ISIL. According to France 24, an estimated 3,000 professing Christian families have been displaced. And friends, let me see. I think we have a little more news for you. Oh, there's while we're on something light, circulating all over the internet is this video that wound up on YouTube that's supposed to be the tombstone of Jonah the prophet. But regardless, whether it is or is not, that's not necessarily confirmed. It shows the cruelness of ISIS in their disrespect for the dead, as this video shows an Islamist terrorist smashing a tomb in Mosul. And friends, as he continues in the background, here's some notes on this footage. This footage has emerged of a member of ISIS smashing the tomb of Jonah the prophet, which is supposed to be kept there in Mosul. All right, and that video is available, or has been put on YouTube. Friends, here's some news from today from the United States. Barack Obama has admitted for the first time that the CIA did torture suspects after the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center in New York. The admission has come before the release of a Senate committee report into the actions of the CIA in the wake of the attacks. the president defended CIA Director John Brennan, who has had to apologize to Senate intelligence staff after CIA officers were revealed to have spied on senators while they were writing the report. Tim Nelson has this video report.
It's been a suspicion for years that the United States had captured and tortured detainees in foreign countries following the September the 11th attacks. Now President Obama has admitted those accusations are true.
We did some things that were wrong. We did a whole lot of things that were right, but we tortured some folks. It's important for us not to feel too sanctimonious in retrospect about the tough job that those folks had.
The remarks prepared the ground for the release of a long-awaited Senate committee report into the CIA's actions after 9/11, and comes after the director, John Brennan, apologized to the committee's chair, where he had admitted his operatives had been spying on senators writing the report. But some want more answers and assurances that similar attempts won't happen again.
I can tell you I still think there needs to be a public accounting by the director on what I think are the key issues. And the key issues are who authorized this and why they thought it was legal.
President Obama said that despite this revelation, he still had full confidence in the CIA boss. Tim Nielsen, BBC News.
Brethren, these things are coming out at a time when Israel is trying to find the rest of those tunnels and to eliminate the weaponry that Hamas has. And it's coming at a time when the Ukraine crisis, NATO operating in that area is about to just be dismantled because of NATO's being poorly prepared for a future attack from Russia on one of its member states. And all of this really relates back to a verse we've been reading on Nightcast a lot, even on the news program. Well, it's news related to the Bible and prophecy, so I go to the Bible. We've been reading a lot, several times I've been focusing in on verse 19 of Leviticus 26, part of one of the two blessings and cursings chapters, as we've called them in the church for a long time, Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28, that starts out saying, look, if you as individuals and collectively as a nation, if you obey your God, here are a list of all the blessings I'm going to give you. And focusing on some mentioned in Deuteronomy 28, he says, I'll make you the head, not national blessings I'm referring to now. He says, nationally I'll make you the head, not the tail. I'll make you the lender, not the borrower. One of you will chase 100. 100 of you will chase 10,000. And so on and so on. And I'll give you rain in due season. I'll bless your fruit trees and your crops, your agriculture. But if you don't obey me, then just the opposite of all that. You'll be the borrower, not the lender. We have been pointing out, look at the United States. We're one of the biggest borrowers in the world and not the lender. We are fastly becoming no longer the head, but rapidly descending toward the tail wagging the dog, toward becoming the tail. And what else? We're in the worst drought. Talk about, he says, I'll bless you with plenty of rain. The United States is in the worst drought ever. Just a few weeks ago, we were saying, the news was saying the worst drought since 1956. No longer says it that way. It says we're now in the worst drought ever. Pictures of the Colorado River, parts of it becoming bacon earth. Horrible sight where there used to be beautiful water flowing, just baked earth, big parts of that. And this is what God says will happen unless you repent. And all of that, you repent, all that can turn around. You don't repent, God says, look, then I'll punish you 7 times more, getting to the point of the crux of the matter in verse 26 of Leviticus 19, where he says, or did I say that backward? Leviticus 26, verse 19 is what we want. Verse 19 of Leviticus 26, God there says, starting verse 18 to introduce it, and if you will not yet for all this hearken unto me, obey my commands, then I will punish you 7 times more for your sins. And verse 19, and I will break the pride of your power. And you know, friends, that's what's happening to the United States in this admission and things that maybe just don't even need to be brought up and said. Happening at a time when Israel needs support of the United States, when NATO needs to be firmed up for the protection of the allies and the dollar over in Europe. But we've got, it seems, naive people that either don't care or they're more intelligent than they're appearing to be, and they've got a goal of the utter destruction of the United States from the inside out. You know, that'd be a great plan for somebody to do in Israel, put somebody in office in Israel who wants to destroy Israel. It almost seems like that's what we have here in the United States. The Commons Defense Committee says Russian actions in Ukraine suggested serious deficiencies in NATO's readiness to deal with threats, and said that radical reform was needed. The MPs, the members of parliament, said the risk of a conventional assault remained low, but warned over methods such as cyber attacks and the use of irregular militias. NATO said it would study the findings, and we've got a report on this by Nick Childs.
Vladimir Putin savouring the moment in historic Sevastopol of Russia's annexation of Crimea. But according to this hard-hitting new report, this event, the continuing violence in Ukraine and earlier crises in Georgia and Estonia have been a wake-up call for NATO. Having not considered Russia an adversary for 20 years, MPs say the alliance is now poorly prepared to defend its vulnerable Baltic allies in particular, if Moscow turned its attention in their direction.
What Russia's doing at the moment is difficult to respond to, because NATO set up for an armed attack. It assumed tanks rolling across borders. But when you're looking at separatist groups with Russian intelligence officers, cyber attacks, information warfare, you're looking at a much more difficult thing to deal with, and that's where the challenge for NATO lies.
NATO has responded, including boosting air patrols in the Baltic to try to reassure its uneasy allies in the region. However, the report wants more. But is that realistic?
They are talking about more exercising, some more deployments, some changes in the NATO command structure. Now, of course, all this will come as a cost, but the report also underlines the degree to which NATO actually is still a very powerful military alliance, and in some ways rather more powerful than Russia.
Britain has sent Typhoon fighters to the Baltic. The report says recent events are also a game-changer for British defence policy, but the government insists it hasn't dropped its guard.
We're spending 2% of GDP. We want the other countries to commit to that. Many of them spend less. We have the largest defence budget in Europe, the second largest in the whole of NATO. It's time other countries did more.
With a NATO summit in Wales in September, the report is calling on the British government to take a lead in what is, it says, not just a challenge for the alliance, but also a unique opportunity to re-establish its relevance. Nick Childs, BBC News.
Okay, thank you, Nick Childs. And I've got a excerpt, friends, from a video from May 29 that appeared on part of the Hard Talk program. The former advisor to Russian President Vladimir Putin, Professor Sergei Karaganov, has told BBC Hard Talk that Ukraine will never have membership of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. He was responding to a question about what the bottom line message from Russia to Ukraine's new president, Petro Poroshenko, would be if they wanted to join the organization. He says a friendly Ukraine is our great hope. And Professor Karaganov, who is one of Russia's most influential foreign policy thinkers said, unfortunately, the Ukrainian, you'll hear him in this video, I'm going to play this for you. Unfortunately, the Ukrainian leadership has failed to have a viable state.
The bottom line message to new President Poroshenko in Ukraine is, understand this, that you will never be allowed to join European Western institutions like NATO and the European Union, and that your state will always, because Moscow insists upon it, be deeply fragmented. Is that what you're saying?
No, I mean, if you're able, to do to have a more or less coherent state after the failure of the elites for over 20 years, and you are part of these elites, do your best. I mean, a peaceful, friendly Ukraine is our great hope. Unfortunately, Ukrainian elite has failed to have a viable state. As to NATO membership, that is exactly what I would say to them.
Never.
Never.
Before we finish, one final thought. You've set the scene on a mindset in Moscow which blames so much on the West and Western policies. Is it not the case that actually the Soviet system collapsed from within? And it is very likely that the Putin system will collapse from within too. If you look at demographic decline in your country today, if you look at corruption across the economy and the judiciary, if you look at your dysfunctional politics and economy dominated by the state, the oligarchs, Russia doesn't have a good long-term future.
I must say that I have lived long enough in my country. I mean, we were collapsing in the 80s. We collapsed in the 90s. I mean, somehow, miraculously, we survived. So we are now in stagnation.
But fundamentally weakened.
Yes. No. I mean, we grew from the ashes. I mean, 1999, my country was a failed state. Nobody acknowledged that. I mean, thanks God. I mean, if Maidan would have started there, I mean, it would have been finished. It was absolutely. It was. I believe that the only explanation that we survived was that the Almighty decided to help us.
I just want to pin you down, yes or no. Do you think Putin's Russia is on a trajectory of strength and success or not?
At this juncture, not yet. Hopefully it will.
Well, you know, friends, I wish the hard talk commentator hadn't interrupted him there, as he was just starting to comment on how he felt like the Almighty turned around things for Russia. Took him out of the pit, brought him back up. And, you know, friends, who knows? A lot of people have said Mr. Armstrong thought, I listened to one program last night where he thought things would wrap up surely by 2000. But, you know, I'm not embarrassed by that comment on his part, because that's perhaps how things should have gone, except that some of us were so asleep and took so long to wake up. God and Christ talked it over, decided, look, they need more time, you know, and let's give them a little mercy. I mean, we should be wrapping this thing up, but Mr. Armstrong's already resting in the grave. Let's see where this will go during this situation. We're really learning people, and some of them need more time, need to have their hand held a little bit more and a little better, and let's give them the time they need. And it's been perhaps merciful to a lot of us, and some of you that have started to watch here now, that your parents were in the church, you were born during this time when it would have maybe should have been over. And now you have an opportunity, and some of you are interested in that, and that's extremely interesting to me. And I'm glad to see you young people coming on board with into the body of Christ and being interested in being part of the first resurrection. Now, I know some of you feel like a lot of us felt when we were younger, oh, I'll never have it, but I won't be able to get married and have a family and all that, you know. And as Mr. Armstrong has pointed out, the joys in the kingdom will be so much greater than any joys in this physical life that it's an opportunity you really don't want to miss. Friends, I got just a few more things to go, and then give Mr. Armstrong a few closing words, and then I'm going to have to sign off. This next video, I want you to know what's going on in Ukraine today. Let me check my notes on something real quick. Yeah, this is today, just a few hours ago. A team of 70 Dutch and Australian forensic experts has found human remains at the site of the flight MH17, that crash that went down in eastern Ukraine. These investigators have made their discovery on their first full day of searching at the site, an area of some 35 square kilometers, that'd be about 13 and a half square miles, inside the conflict zone. Local search parties found 227 of the 298 victims earlier, and they were flown to the Netherlands for identification. Presidents Obama and Putin discussed the crisis by telephone yesterday, and Tom Burridge has a report on this.
Finally, real progress. Dozens of Dutch and Australian military police and forensics experts searched the countryside around the wreckage of Flight MH17. This was the largest team of international experts to come here since the airliner was blown up more than 2 weeks ago as it flew over this area. They spent several hours here, collecting the luggage, as well as some of the remains of those who died, as fighting continues nearby. Ukraine's army has been gaining ground, but neither its soldiers nor the pro-Russian separatists control the crash site. And not far away, Ukrainian government forces seem to have taken all the ground surrounding the regional capital of Donetsk. But taking the city will be much harder, with a much higher cost. This video can't be verified, but Ukraine's army says it shows weapons it seized from rebel forces. Europe and the US accuse Russia of arming the rebels, something Russia vehemently denies. And there is an ever-growing number of people forced from their homes as they flee the fighting in eastern Ukraine. Meanwhile, back at the crash site, one Dutch military police officer who was present at today's search described this area of countryside as a giant graveyard. And their mission, before investigating the wreckage, is to collect any remaining bodies, to bring dignity to those who died. Tom Burridge, BBC News, in Kiev.
Thank you, Tom. Brethren, just a couple more videos before we go back to Mr. Armstrong and close tonight. This will give you some things that hopefully you've had a wonderful Sabbath. You're thanking God for a wonderful and great Sabbath today. And before you totally finish the day off, actually it's a new day starting at sunset, but before you hit the sack tonight, you know, you might want to do some hearty prayer in the way that Jesus Christ instructed us in Luke 21 verse 36, where he says, watch and pray always. And then he adds a promise that if you do that, here's the promise, verse 36, watch you therefore, and the therefore is referring back to the things that relate to the seals of Revelation 6 that Jesus Christ described in plain language in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, as Christ was answering the question the disciples asked him about what would be the sign of your return and the end of this age. And Jesus Christ described these seals. Now we've had the first 4 seals. We're in between the 4th seal and the 5th seal. Mr. Armstrong having said before he died that the next major event in world prophecy is the 5th seal, the Great Tribulation. And that Great Tribulation has not occurred yet. That'll be the time of Jacob's trouble. It'll be the beginning of World War III. We'll see a revived Holy Roman Empire, a false prophet ruling over it. You know, a lot of us recognize, understand, and know that'll be the Pope. And it'll be, let's see, I mentioned great martyrdom, revival of the Holy Roman Empire, a great martyrdom, Jacob's trouble, World War III will begin. All of that has not occurred yet. That's the next major thing to happen in prophecy. But Christ told us in relation to that. Christ said in verse 36 of Luke 21, he said, watch these things that, again, were in this chart. Put it back on this screen. Yeah, watch the things on this chart, those 4 seals before the tribulation, because he's going to make mention of the tribulation next in this verse. He says, "Watch you therefore and pray always that you may be accounted worthy to escape all these things." And all these things include the next seal, the 5th seal, the Great Tribulation, that's just down the pike. You know, we don't know how far or how short, but the way news is going, looks like God's decided, okay, Christ, let's don't delay it anymore, let's let it roll. Now, they could slow it down. And Russia was surprised that they went from the pits, you know, and coming back up now. But, you know, and they felt like the Almighty had something to do with that. Interesting to hear that Russian man say that in that news report. And he may well be right, because Russia has some things in prophecy that they are, God's Word says they will be doing. And so God needed them to be back up. So even though they hit the bottom, God had mercy on them. A couple more things I want you to see, and then we'll have let Mr. Armstrong finish it up, and then you'll have plenty of things from today's news, brethren. You won't even have to do any work after tonight. You've watched it during today's Sabbath service. Just get on your knees and pray about these things before you go to bed, and that makes you become an active part of today's world news by filtering what you see and hear through your thought process, and then sending your prayers up to God and saying, "Hey, God, would you consider this or that? I'd like to see you do this or that, or help this out, or bring..." Whatever you say can have a lot of impact on how the news goes that you are saying to God in prayer. And here's one that God, I know, would like to see all of us have some concern about. Tunisia has closed its main border crossing with Libya after thousands of stranded Egyptian and other foreign nationals tried to break through. Tunisia is the main escape route as fighting escalates in the Libyan capital, Tripoli, where rival militias have been battling for weeks for control of the airport. Several countries have already urged their nationals to leave Libya. Rana Yawid reports from Tripoli.
Chaos, anger and frustration at Libya's key border crossing with Tunisia. Thousands of people, including foreigners, are desperate to leave Libya, but the Tunisian authorities have turned back those without a valid visa. Following the clashes, Tunisian officials have closed the Ras Jdir border crossing on Friday. It's likely to be a temporary move. This is a vital lifeline for both countries. This is what is prompting a steady exit from Tripoli by diplomats, foreigners and Libyans. For nearly 3 weeks, rival militias have been battling for control of Tripoli's international airport. It resembles a scrapyard now. The protracted violence is mostly concentrated in the south of the capital. Many Libyans say they are forced to leave the capital because of ongoing violence and a growing sense of insecurity.
You turn the television on and you don't understand anything. There is no news to explain what's happening. You hear rumors, so you are afraid. That's why people are forced to escape to Tunisia or Europe.
Tunisia has become the latest country to ask all its nationals to leave Libya. The shortage of essential items like fuel is also adding to the insecurity. The latest violence came shortly after a largely peaceful parliamentary election in late June. The new parliament is due to convene on Monday, but it is not clear whether it can influence events on the ground. Rana Jawad, BBC News, Tripoli.
And friends, here's a story that sad to see, and especially as we take a look at the 2 blessings and cursings chapters, and we see the United States having had a hand in this, is just not only shameful, but should put some fear in our hearts, because as this kind of abomination upsets the eternal, those who have encouraged people who had passed a law they had passed a tough anti-gay legislation that was signed into law in February. That bill passed by members of Parliament and this, let's see, I got conflicting notes here, friends, but this bill was fiercely criticized by human rights groups and prompted some Western countries to cut aid. You'll hear in this video who one of those countries that cut aid was. I'm ashamed to say it here. Catherine, reporter from Kampala, will give us this video report on it.
That was the reaction in a packed courtroom after the judge made the ruling on the anti-gay law enacted earlier this year. It's one of the fastest verdicts issued by the Constitutional Court in Uganda. The 5-judge panel concluded that the measure is illegal because it was passed during a parliamentary session that lacked a quorum. Lawyers and activists had challenged the Anti-Homosexuality Act on the grounds that it violated human rights. Today's verdict by the courts was well received by gay rights campaigners.
This shows that, that some of the laws that are passed on homosexuality are not passed in good faith.
While signing the bill in February, the Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni said he wanted to deter Western groups from promoting homosexuality among African children. The law drew condemnation in the West, and several countries, including the US, even withheld funding to some Ugandan institutions. But the anti-gay law was very popular in Uganda, and its supporters opposed Friday's verdict.
We are asking, why, if the president's travel next week to meet Barack Obama, who has been putting pressure in the US-Africa summit, if that in any way is linked up with the unprecedented lightning speed with which this law has been struck down?
The government denies any involvement in the judgment. It says the ruling shows Uganda's democratic system is functioning very well. This verdict could spark a long-running legal battle between the government and gay rights activists. The state now has two options. It can table the same piece of legislation before Parliament, but make sure it has the right number of MPs present to pass it legally. It holds the majority in the House. Secondly, it can challenge the ruling in the Supreme Court. Catherine Biarhanga, BBC News, Kampala.
Thank you, Catherine. And friends, though, you heard in that report government people saying from the U.S. saying that, oh, that's a sign that democracy is functioning well, that this thing got turned around like it did. Baloney. That you know. I don't want to preach too much to the choir, but these people should take a look at Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, because they are helping to bring curses upon the countries that put into law such abominable things that are a stench in the nostril of our Creator. All right, friends, just a couple more news items that you should be aware of before you go to bed tonight. We're watching China carefully, friends, especially because it being part of the BRICS coalition that has a goal of knocking the Yankee dollar out of position as the world reserve currency and out of position as the petro currency also. And although this is not directly that per se, but it's an event that's happened that we take note of from today's news. An explosion in a metal products factory in the eastern city of Kunshan has killed at least 65 people, according to Chinese state media. More than 100 others were injured in the blast in a workshop for polishing wheel hubs. Rescue efforts are underway and officials are investigating the cause of the explosion. Jim Sudworth reports.
looks like the emergency response has been pretty good and pretty swift, even sending burns experts, medical experts from Shanghai to help in any way they're able to. This looks like a very large-scale medical emergency. It's unlikely that the hospitals in a city of the size of Kunshan will be able to cope fully with this sort of disaster. So that's why I think there's been this immediate move to send experts in from other cities. No word yet on what's caused this, but I think the focus in the media coverage, at least, will be on the possibility of this being another example of lax safety standards in China. Last year, there was a terrible accident in a poultry factory in the northeast of the country, which killed more than 100 workers. In some industries, over recent years, safety standards have been improving. Coal mining, for example, figures show that the safety record there is getting gradually better. But China is still a developing country. It still has a lot of work to do, and often people suggesting there is a political problem here as well, because, of course, in these local provinces, it is the Communist Party that not only runs the government and the safety inspections, but often, of course, runs the industry as well. So it's acting as poacher and gamekeeper, and some people suggest, therefore, its safety enforcement is not always as good as it should be.
And friends, interesting. That was China. Now, interestingly, in the news also with a fatality type of thing is India. Another one, China and India both are members of that BRICS coalition working against the United States dollar. And from India, authorities there in a western state there say the chances of finding anyone alive in the debris caused by a landslide on Wednesday are slim. This landslide happened Wednesday morning this week. The death toll has risen to 64, and it is feared that it will rise even further as scores are still buried in the mud. Zubair Ahmed reports.
Scraping through the mud, looking for survivors, withstanding bad weather. Rescue workers are working around the clock to see if there are survivors. So far they have found just a few. The non-stop rains are making it difficult. They say the chances of anyone being alive in the mud are fast fading. This was a village where dozens of families lived. But now all you see is mud everywhere. On Wednesday, a large muddy chunk of the mountain fell on the village, flattening the huts. Vithabai Savre had a lucky escape.
I went to the field early that morning. When I came back, my entire neighborhood disappeared. If I had stayed back, I would have been buried there.
With each passing moment, the death toll keeps rising, bringing much grief and ending their hopes in flames. Friends, relatives and onlookers from neighboring villages have been waiting for long for good news. But for some others, the long wait was over. Those found dead are being brought here for the last rites according to the local customs.
Okay, friends, there's something that you'll perhaps be able to put some heart into before you hit the sack tonight. We're going to let Mr. Armstrong finish up in his meeting with the Speaker of the Knesset in 1983. This is from 1983. Thanks for joining us today, friends. Mr. Armstrong will finish, and we'll let that be it for today, this Sabbath, as you can see the date below. Thanks for joining me. We'll be back again Sunday night with Nightcast, and back here, same channel, next week for the next Sabbath.
People of Israel, and we come here in peace to help, to give, to share. We know we're not going to bring peace now. My job is to proclaim the way of peace, not to accomplish peace, but to proclaim the way of the Almighty God, who's going to accomplish it and going to do it to us, whether we like it or whether we don't. He is going to compel people to have peace.
Oh,
and it's going to take force. It's going to take a force greater than human force. And in the meantime, we just try to have as much peace as we can. Now, I'm a friend of Arab people, a friend of the Israelis, a friend of the Japanese, a friend of black people in Africa, and we have projects in all of these countries. And we know we're not going to bring peace, but we believe we should do what we can toward peace in the meantime. And I proclaim the way of peace.
Well, Mr. Armstrong, I am, first of all, very privileged to have you in my office, in the fortress of Israel's democracy. May I just present you with the Medal of the Knesset. It features the building and then the sides of the three monotheistic faces that Jerusalem is holy to them. Mm-hmm. So here is the medal which shows Jerusalem, for which you have done so much, and the Knesset, the only fortress of democracy in the Middle East. And here is what I say to the Honorable Mr. Herbert Armstrong in appreciation of his true friendship for the land and people of Israel and his magnanimous gestures which aid and strengthen the spiritual and moral tenets of our common culture. Menachem Savidor, Speaker of the Knesset, with my best wishes.
Oh, thank you so much. That's a wonderful honor.
The Middle East now is seething with crisis after crisis. Now, very few realize the significance of what is going on now in the Middle East. As I said, Bible prophecy shows very plainly that the whole center of world disturbances is going to be in the Middle East from now on until Armageddon, the final battle of World War III, and the end of this world. Now, I have a booklet just off the press